It's not very cold this time, but the rupee depreciation is sending shivers down every spine. And that is what we discussed this time on Point. As a maverick observer of the Indian economy, I like to take these discussions with you, but I like it most when you are able to see when a new notification is there for the Point. And the best way to look at that is to press the bell icon whenever a new episode comes up. And now, onwards with our story. What's happening to the rupee? That's going to be the discussion. That is already the discussion in many midnight evening bonfires across India. But let's get some data into this entire business to understand what's happening with the rupee. It has gone down below 90 to $1. That means you have to pay 90 rupees to get $1 of value. What does this mean? Just a few months ago it was 85 rupees to $1. This has been this time the fastest slide from say 85 to 90 for the rupee, the second fastest as per SBI calculations since the taper tantrum. But is that a cause for worry? I argue no, and let's understand why. Now, a very interesting data. The rupee has gone down, and this year the demand from corporates for rupee denominated bonds has gone up extraordinarily. Foreign banks, which typically arrange loans for Indian companies in dollar, are queuing up to instead issue rupee denominated debt. That doesn't sound like a currency which is in flight, does it? So that's what the point of this episode is. What's happening here? Well, the RBI has also made it clear that it is not overly worried about what is happening with the rupee. The rupee is sliding, that's all. And it's bound to slide because of the obvious factors that in this year, foreign portfolio investors have net withdrawn from Indian equities by $17 billion. I'm talking of data as till 3rd December 2025. If you look at the equity and debt together, it's about $8 billion withdrawal. That's a substantial amount. But at the same time, Indian investors are piling in. So let's parse through the data to understand what's happening for different parts of the economy. First of all, the chattering class, the people who make the noises, the people who write editorials. What is that? What are they saying? Well, they are finding it bad. And the reason is they send out money to their relatives, to their children studying abroad. Large number of us do. And obviously, when the rupee is depreciating so fast, it means that the amount of dollar that rupee can purchase is skimming out. In other words, the rupee is buying less dollars, so there's less money to send out to people. That's a reason to be concerned. But look at the other end of the income stream, the poorer people, those who work abroad, the Gulf workers, the people who take the donkey route to travel abroad. What's happening? The remittance that they are sending back to India, and remember, India is the highest receiver of remittances in the world. The value of those remittances is going up. So in villages of Punjab, in villages of Kerala, in towns of Gujarat, everywhere else, wherever these migrants have gone, there is reason to celebrate. There's more rupee now available for the dollar. So it's not a one-way street. Let's look at another thing. What does the rupee slide mean for you and me when we go out to shop? Well, if I'm buying a domestically produced piece of cloth, if I'm buying domestic grocery, I don't really bother whether the price of the rupee is going up or down in the international market. If it's an orderly movement, definitely not, because with inflation under control, my lifestyle doesn't change. It would change, however, for those items which I buy which are imported from abroad. And the best example of that, the petrol that we use, the diesel that we use, the gas that we use, almost all of it comes from abroad. So yes, those prices will tend to go up. The import bill for them will go up. But will the prices of those items go up? Not necessarily, unless the government decides that it will pass on the price hike on to us. So that remains to be seen in the future months. What does it mean for our other sectors? Well, those sectors which depend on imports, and we import a lot of items from China, we import a lot of items from other countries to run our industrial sector. We also import urea for our agricultural sector. The prices of those will rise. And if they rise, essentially that means we are importing inflation into our country. But hang on, at this stage, the domestic inflation in India is not just zero, it's at some stages it is even negative. So the impact of those price rise is not substantial, not by any means. We are not running into trouble by whatsoever. That's a very important point. Our price rise happening in a hyperinflation period or even a heavy inflation period would have been a difficult process. Not now. Let's look at something more. What does this episode of the rupee sliding mean for the exporters? Yes, you will say exporters, obviously they'll benefit. But let me look at something more. And this is where again we look at a bit of data. Remember the initial stage I had said that the foreign banks are also now issuing Indian bonds? Well, one of the reasons Indian rupee was not a sought after commodity was precisely because the government of India for many decades followed a policy of keeping the rupee overvalued. Look at this data. The real effective exchange rate. Shorn of jargon, what does it mean? A currency, say Indian rupee to a dollar, has a value, that's the exchange rate. But that doesn't tell the whole story. To understand what is it exactly, one has to look at what is called the real power of the rupee and the dollar in each other's currency. And there's a way of calculating it. This is the formula. If you go into it, you would find that in India, this formula should always, everywhere in the world, this formula should always yield the value of 1 or 100, basically meaning neutral, that the rupee is neither overvalued or undervalued. But again, as this chart shows, Indian rupee has always been kept overvalued. So for the exporters, we had high labor costs, we had high power costs, electricity costs, we had high capital costs, and we had high land costs. And together with that, we had a pricey rupee. Yes, a pricey rupee. So all the five together added meant any export from India was always uncompetitive. When President Trump put up the 25% tariff in April this year and followed it up with another 25% in June, what did it mean? India essentially, all the exports of India became extremely uncompetitive. The data is showing that up now as gradually exports to USA thin out. So what should a smart government do? Well, it can reduce labor cost. The labor code is an example. It can reduce electricity cost. Not much happening on the power sector. It can reduce land cost. That's not happening. It can reduce capital cost. Well, there's been some work on that. But at the very short term, it can reduce the cost of rupee. And how can it do so? By reducing the overvaluation of rupee, bringing rupee more into sync with the price of, say, dollar, a euro, a pound, a yen. And that is what is happening. The depreciation of the rupee, the RBI is not really pushing ahead to stop the depreciation, means that the rupee is now gradually inching closer to that magic value of 100, which means that the real effective exchange rate of the rupee is now closer to its true value. If that is a true value, then Indian exporters can recoup quite a bit of the loss from the tariffs, from the higher tariffs, say from USA. How much could that be? Well, it could almost be something like, recovering something like 10 to 15% of the total tariff. So out of the 25% high tariff, about 10 to 15% could be wiped off by making the rupee more competitive. So I expect that the competitive rupee will actually sharpen, enhance the capacity of our exporters. And that's very good news, and that helps us a lot. It expands the manufacturing sector. It does plenty of other things besides. And as I said earlier, that the smart ideas of this sort helps the Indian economy to grow faster. So overall, the rupee depreciation makes for good headline, but it doesn't lead to an enormous cause of worry. Certainly not for the Indian companies, otherwise they would not have been borrowing in rupee in big time. They know why they're borrowing. The foreign banks are also following in suit, and that is why the Reserve Bank is not particularly worried. And with a low inflation, we seem to be in a sweet spot as of now, and that is a very good note to end this year. A very happy new year to you from On Point. That's all. For a detailed description of what we discussed here, please visit my Substack. The link is in the description below. Thank you.